The twin sons of Veltar cast long shadows across the crystal city as panic spread through the streets. In the Grand Council chamber, hundreds of Zephyrians pressed against the walls, their silver skin gleaming with fierce sweat. The massive viewing screen showed the same terrifying image that had haunted their nightmares for months, a dark cloud moving between the stars.
Swallowing.
High Counselor Threndel stood at the center of the chamber, his forearms trembling as he pointed at the screen. "Look at them," he whispered, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The Devourers grow closer every day. Our fastest ships cannot outrun them. Our strongest weapons cannot pierce their hulls." The crowd murmured in despair. Children clung to their parents while elders shook their heads in defeat. The Zephyrians had always been a peaceful race, builders and artists who had never known true war. Their ships were designed for exploration, not battle. Their weapons were meant for mining, not killing. "We have tried everything," continued another counselor, her voice cracking. "We sent messages to every known civilization, begging for help. No one answered. No one came." A young Zephyrian scientist named Kethmer pushed through the crowd. "What about the old stories?" he called out. "The legends say that when darkness comes, the light will answer. When evil threatens the innocent, divine beings will descend from the heavens." The crowd fell silent. Even the counselors stopped there. Worried whispers. The old stories were just tales told to children, weren't they? Stories of beautiful winged beings who protected the weak and fought against the forces of evil. Legends, scoffed an elderly counselor. "We need real help, not fairy tales." But Threndel raised his hand for silence. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "it is time to remember the old ways. Our ancestors built temples to the sky gods. They prayed for protection against the darkness of space. Maybe we should do the same." The decision was made quickly. Badokos Veltar, the Zephyrians began to pray. They gathered in the great squares and lifted their voices to the stars. They built small shrines and offered their most precious crystals. They sang the ancient songs their grandparents had taught them, songs about light conquering darkness and good defeating evil. For 7 days and 7 nights, the prayers continued. The Devourers came closer, their massive ships now visible too. The naked eye. Some Zephyrians lost hope and fled to the outer colonies. Others prayed even harder, believing that their faith would be rewarded. On the 8th day, the sky began to change. It started as a small shimmer in the air above the capital city. As the shimmer grew larger, spreading like ripples on water. Colors danced within it, gold and silver and pure white light. The air itself seemed to sing with a beautiful music that made everyone who heard it feel peaceful and safe. Then the portals opened. Brilliant beams of light shot down from the sky, and through them came the most beautiful beings the Zephyrians had ever seen. They were tall and graceful, with perfect faces that seemed to glow from within. Their robes flowed like liquid starlight, changing colors as they moved. Most amazing of all were their wings, great feathered appendages that sparkled with every color of the rainbow. The crowd gasped in wonder. Children pointed and laughed with joy. Adults fell to their knees in amazement. These were the beings from the old stories, the divine messengers who came to save the innocent. The leader of these beings stepped forward, his feet not quite touching the ground. When he spoke, his voice was like music, filling every mind with warmth and comfort. "Do not fear, children of Veltar," he said, and somehow every Zephyrian in the city could hear him clearly. "We are the Seraphim, guardians of peace and justice throughout the galaxy. We have heard your prayers and felt your fear. We have come to save you from the darkness that approaches." The being who called himself Lumineth spread his arms wide. "The creatures you call Devourers are indeed terrible. They have consumed thousands of worlds, bringing suffering and death wherever they go. But we have the power to stop them. We have the strength to protect you." The crowd erupted in cheers. People hugged each other and wept with relief. The children who had been crying now laughed and played. The elders who had lost hope now smiled with joy. "But," Lumineth continued, and the crowd grew quiet again, "such protection requires sacrifice. We are beings of pure spirit, and we need the faith and devotion of those we protect to maintain our strength in this physical realm. He gestured to the beautiful crystal spires around them. Build temples in our honor, that we might have places to rest and gather our power. Offer us your finest crystals and your most advanced technologies, that we might forge weapons capable of defeating the Devourers. Most importantly, trust us completely. Follow our guidance without question, for we know the cosmic forces that threaten you. Zephyrians agreed immediately. Within hours, construction crews were tearing down old buildings to make room for magnificent temples. Military commanders handed over their weapons and disbanded their forces, declaring them unnecessary now that divine protection had arrived. Scientists eagerly shared their most secret discoveries, happy to contribute to their salvation in all the celebration and relief. None of the Zephyrians stopped to wonder why all-powerful divine beings would need mortal weapons and technology. None questioned why creatures of pure spirit would require physical temples and material offerings. They were too grateful, too relieved, too overwhelmed by the beauty and majesty of their supposed saviors to think such thoughts. The Seraphim had come, and Veltar was saved. Or so they believed. 6 months had passed since the Seraphim arrived on Veltar, and something was terribly wrong. The beautiful crystal city that once sparkled with life now felt cold and empty. The Zephyrians moved through their daily routines like sleepwalkers, their silver skin pale and dull. Kethmer sat in his laboratory, staring at the same disturbing readings he had been seeing for weeks. The young scientist rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the data again, hoping he had made a mistake. But the numbers were clear. The Devourers were not slowing down. In fact, they were moving faster than ever before. This cannot be right, he muttered to himself, checking his instruments for the 100th time. According to his calculations, the massive alien ships would reach Veltar in less than 3 weeks. Where was the divine fleet that Lumineth had promised? Where were the mighty weapons that would destroy the Devourers? Outside his window, he could see the great temple that now dominated the city center. It was a massive structure of white stone and gold, built exactly as the Seraphim had demanded. Day and night, Zephyrians came to pray and leave offerings. They brought their finest crystals, their most advanced computer systems, even their children's toys, believing that everything they gave would help power their protectors. But Kethmer noticed something that others seemed to miss. The Seraphim never left their temples. They never worked on building weapons or ships. They simply sat on their golden thrones and accepted the worship of the people. Growing more beautiful and radiant with each passing day, the scientist had tried to speak with other Zephyrians about his concerns. But they all gave him the same dreamy response. The Seraphim know best, they would say, their eyes unfocused and distant. We must trust in their divine wisdom. Even his own family had changed. His sister, once a brilliant engineer, now spent all her time at the temple, praying and singing hymns. His elderly father, who had always been sharp in questioning, now smiled vacantly whenever Kethmer tried to discuss the approaching danger. Finally, Kethmer could wait no longer. He gathered his courage and walked to the great temple, his heart pounding with each step. The massive doors were carved with images of the Seraphim saving various alien races from destruction. But now those images seemed somehow wrong to him. The saved aliens looked too thin, too frightened, more like prisoners than rescued people. Inside the temple, the air was thick with incense and the sound of constant prayers. Hundreds of Zephyrians knelt on the marble floor, their voices joined. In endless worship, the far end of the chamber, Lumineth sat on his throne of light. His perfect face, serene and beautiful. Kethmer approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. Other Zephyrians turned to look at him with disapproval. It was not proper to disturb the Seraphim during prayer time. But Kethmer had to know the truth. "Great Seraphim," he called out, his voice trembling with fear and desperation. "I've been watching the skies. The Devourers are only weeks away from our world. When will you launch your divine fleet to stop them?" The temple fell silent. Even the constant murmur of prayers stopped. Lumineth slowly turned his glowing eyes toward the young scientist, and for a moment Kethmer saw something that made his blood freeze. Behind the beautiful face, behind the perfect features, was something cold and hungry and utterly alien. Then Lumineth began to laugh. It was not the beautiful musical sound that the Zephyrians had come to love. It was harsh and sharp, like the sound of breaking glass. The laugh echoed through the temple, bouncing off the walls and growing louder with each echo. "Fleet?" Lumineth repeated, his voice now different, colder. "Did you hear that, brothers? The little lamb thinks there is a fleet?" As he spoke, his beautiful appearance began to change. The flowing robes of starlight faded away, revealing something underneath that made Kethmer's stomach turn. The perfect skin became gray and wrinkled. The beautiful face stretched into something long and thin, with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. The graceful hands became twisted claws, and when Lumineth smiled, his teeth were like sharp needles. All around the temple, the other seraphim began to appear. They materialized from the shadows, their own disguises falling away to reveal their true forms. They were creatures of nightmare, beings of shadow and hunger with eyes that glowed like dying stars. Some had tentacles instead of arms. Others had too many mouths, all filled with razor teeth. The Zephyrians in the temple began to scream. But they found they could not move. Some invisible force held them in place, forcing them to watch as their supposed saviors revealed themselves. "You see, little scientist?" Lumineth said, his voice now a sick whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We are shepherds of a sort, travel from world to world, finding the fattest flocks, the most delicious civilizations." Gestured toward the approaching devourer fleet, visible now through the temple's crystal windows. "We guide our partners to the best feeding grounds, make sure the prey is properly prepared, defenseless and afraid. Then we harvest the exquisite, terror and despair of the dying before feeding the survivors to our cosmic partners." Kethmer felt his mind struggling to understand, but our prayers, you said you came to save us. "Your prayers call to us across the void," Lumineth agreed, his horrible smile growing wider. "But not for salvation, little lamb. They called us to dinner. The sweeter the hope, the more delicious the despair when that hope is crushed." The scientist looked around desperately. "Our military, out. Our defenses, all dismantled at our suggestion." Lumineth laughed again. "Your weapons are gone. Your ships are scrapped. Your soldiers are now temple servants. You are completely helpless, exactly as we planned." Through the temple windows, the Devourer's ships grew larger, their massive forms blotting out the stars. Kethmer realized with growing horror that his people had been betrayed from the very beginning. The beautiful angels they had welcomed were nothing more than farmers preparing their world for harvest. "Your doom approaches," Lumineth whispered, his glowing eyes fixed on the terrified scientist. "And there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it." The great temple of Veltar had become a prison. Kethmer and hundreds of other Zephyrians knelt on the cold marble floor, unable to move or speak. The seraphim had revealed their true forms days ago, and since then, the city had been filled with screams and the sound of destruction. The beautiful crystal spires were cracking under some invisible pressure, and the air itself seemed to taste of fear and despair. Through the massive windows of the temple, everyone could see the approaching nightmare. The Devourer fleet filled the sky like a plague of locusts. Their bioships so large they blocked out entire sections of stars. The ships looked alive, with writhing tentacles and pulsing surfaces that glowed with sick green light. Some were shaped like massive jellyfish, others like twisted snakes kilometers long. All of them radiated hunger. Lumineth stood at the center of the temple, his twisted form now completely revealed. His gray skin was covered in scars and strange symbols, and his hollow eyes glowed with malevolent joy. Around him, his fellow seraphim writhed and danced, their shadow tentacles and extra mouths moving in patterns that hurt to look at. "Look at them," Lumineth whispered, his voice echoing in every Zephyrian's mind. "Our partners are beautiful in their simplicity. They do not lie or pretend. They simply consume. Soon they will be here, and the feast will begin." The other seraphim laughed, their voices like breaking glass and screaming wind. One of them, a creature with too many eyes, and mouths that opened in impossible places, spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "The fear is almost ready," it said, tasting the air with a long, forked tongue. "A few more days of terror, and they will be perfectly seasoned. The Devourers will be so pleased with this batch." Kethmer tried to close his eyes, but found he could not. The Seraphim's power forced him to watch, to see his world's approaching doom. He thought of his sister, trapped somewhere in the city, probably experiencing the same helpless terror. He thought of his father, who had trusted the false angels completely. He thought of all the children who had laughed and played when the Seraphim first arrived. Suddenly, a sharp, crackling sound filled the temple. The massive communication screen on the wall flickered to life, showing static and interference. The Seraphim turned toward it with annoyance. "What is this?" Lumineth hissed. "We destroyed all their communication systems." But the static cleared, and a voice came through the speakers. It was speaking in a language the Zephyrians had never heard before. But somehow the words were being translated automatically. "This is Captain Lee Jun-ho of the Terran Defense Fleet," the voice said clearly. It sounded tired but strong, like someone who had seen many battles. "We received your distress signal 3 cycles ago. Our fleet is approaching your system. Do not surrender. Help is coming." The temple fell silent. Even the Seraphim stopped their writhing dance to stare at the screen. The voice continued, calm and steady, despite the static. "To the people of Veltar, this is Captain Lee Jun-ho speaking. We know you are afraid. We know you feel hopeless. But we want you to know that you are not alone. The Terran Defense Fleet is here, and we will fight for you." For a moment, Kethmer felt something he had not experienced in months: hope. Someone had heard their prayers. Someone was coming to help. But then he saw the Seraphim's reaction, and his heart sank again. Lumineth was laughing. All of the Seraphim were laughing, their horrible voices filling the temple with sounds of mocking joy. They slapped their twisted limbs against the floor and howled with amusement. "Humans!" Lumineth wheezed between laughs. "Did you hear that? Brothers, the Deathworlders, think they can help us." Another Seraphim, this one covered in shadow tentacles that moved like living smoke, joined in the laughter. "Humans," it repeated, as if the word itself was a joke. "Those violent little primitives from the death world called Earth." Lumineth turned to face the paralyzed Zephyrians, his needled teeth gleaming in the temple's light. "Your new saviors are the most primitive species in this part of the galaxy," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "They only achieved interstellar travel about a century ago. They still fight with chemical explosives and metal projectiles. They know nothing of our power, nothing of the cosmic forces they face." The shadow-tentacled Seraphim writhed with glee. "Their world is a nightmare," it added. "A death world filled with predators, disasters, and endless violence. Earthquakes that split continents, storms that could destroy cities, animals that hunt in packs and kill for sport. The humans are so accustomed to death and suffering that they have forgotten how to fear properly. They will provide amusing entertainment," another Seraphim said, this one with multiple heads that spoke in unison.
Us.
"We will watch them struggle against the Devourers for a few minutes before they are consumed. It will be like watching insects fight against a forest fire." On the communication screen, more voices were coming through. Different humans speaking in calm, professional tones about coordinates and fleet positions. Kethmer could hear the determination in their voices, but he also heard how few they were. Maybe a dozen ships, compared to the thousands of Devourer vessels now entering the system. The main screen switched to show the outer edge of the solar system, where small dots of light were appearing. The human fleet was dropping out of hyperspace, their ships tiny specks against the vast darkness of space. "Look at them," Lumineth said, pointing at the screen with one clawed finger. "So small, so weak, so wonderfully confident in their ignorance." Seraphim's laughter grew louder as more human ships appeared. Kethmer counted maybe 20 vessels, all of them dwarfed by the massive Devourer bioships. It was like watching a group of children armed with sticks, preparing to fight a pack of hungry wolves. The humans come from a world where everything tries to kill them, Lumineth continued, his voice now filled with anticipation. They think this makes them strong. They think this makes them dangerous. But they have never faced beings like us. They have never stood against the cosmic forces of entropy and consumption. Another seraphim, this one with eyes like burning coals, added, "They will learn the difference between surviving on their little death world and facing the true horrors of the universe. They will learn that some nightmares are too big to fight." Human fleet was moving now, their ships spreading out in what looked like a battle formation. On the communication channel, Captain Lee Junho's voice came through again. "All vessels, this is the captain. We can see the enemy fleet, can see what we're up against. Remember why we're here, remember who we're fighting for." The Seraphim's confidence never wavered. They had destroyed civilizations that were millions of years old. They had fed entire star systems to the Devourers. What could a handful of primitive humans possibly do against such cosmic horror? They were about to find out. The human ships appeared on the view screen like ghosts emerging from the darkness of space. Kethmer stared at them in amazement, his heart sinking as he saw how different they were from what he had expected. Were not the shining vessels of peace that his people had always imagined when they dreamed of heroes coming to save them? Instead, the human ships looked like they had been through hell and back. Their hulls were covered in scars, deep gouges, from asteroid impacts, black burn marks from plasma weapons, and patches of different colored metal where repairs had been made in desperate battles. Some ships had entire sections that looked like they had been torn away and rebuilt with whatever materials were available. The largest ship, which the humans called the Indomitable, looked like it had been in 1,000 fights. Its hull was a patchwork of repairs, and strange weapons jutted out from every surface. It was not beautiful like Zephyrian ships, but it looked incredibly tough. It's like something that refused to die no matter how much punishment it took. Inside the great temple, the Seraphim were still laughing as they watched the human fleet approach. Lumineth pointed at the scarred vessels with one clawed finger. "Look at them," he said mockingly. "Their ships are falling apart. They are so primitive they cannot even keep their hulls clean. These are the great warriors who think they can save you." But Kethmer noticed something in the Seraphim's laughter that had not been there before. It sounded forced, like they were trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. On the communication screen, the human captain's voice came. "Through again, Commander Park Min-soo. Begin civilian evacuation immediately. Add all available transports to the surface." The screen switched to show smaller human ships detaching from the main fleet. These were not warships, but transport vessels designed to carry large numbers of people. They were heading straight for Veltar, ignoring the massive Devourer fleet. That filled the sky. "Sir," came another voice, this one belonging to a young woman. "We're detecting massive psychic interference. The Seraphim are trying to enter our minds." Kethmer saw the Seraphim around the temple suddenly focus their attention on the human fleet. Their hollow eyes glowed brighter, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with invisible energy. He had seen this before. It was the same power they had used to control the Zephyrians, to make them helpless and obedient. The psychic attack hit the human fleet like an invisible wave. Kethmer could feel it himself, a crushing pressure that tried to fill his mind with terror and despair. He saw visions of his own death, heard voices commanding him to surrender, promising him that giving up would end his suffering. But the human captain's voice came through the speakers again, calm and unaffected. "Good luck with that. Helm, take us straight into their formation. Let's show these parasites what a death world teaches its children." The Seraphim's confident laughter began to fade. Their psychic attack, which had never failed before, seemed to be having no effect on the humans. At all, Lumineth's hollow eyes widened in surprise and growing anger. "Impossible," he hissed. "No mortal mind can resist our power. They should be paralyzed with fear by now." But the human fleet was moving with perfect coordination, their ships splitting into 3 groups with military precision. One group was heading straight for the Seraphim vessels. Another was moving to intercept the Devourer fleet. The third group was preparing to land on Veltar itself. From the human ships came a sound that made Maris's heart leap with hope laughter. Not the cruel, mocking laughter of the seraphim, but the genuine amusement of people who found something funny. "Is that it?" came a gruff voice through the speakers. My grandmother's scolding hits harder than that. The seraphim were now openly staring at the communication screen in shock. Their most powerful weapon, the psychic attack that had broken the will of countless civilizations, was being laughed at by these primitive humans. "How?" Lumineth whispered, his voice filled with confusion and growing fear. "How are they resisting?" The human fleet began to attack, and immediately it became clear that these were not the primitive warriors the seraphim had expected. Their weapons were unlike anything Kethmer had ever seen. Beams of energy that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once struck the seraphim vessels, passing through their shields as if they were not there. Projectiles that moved faster than light slammed into the alien ships, each impact causing explosions of impossible colors. But most shocking of all, the humans were boarding the seraphim vessels. Small pods launched from the human ships, phasing through the energy shields and attaching to the hulls like parasites. Then human soldiers began cutting their way inside, fighting hand-to-hand with beings of pure psychic energy. Kethmer watched in amazement as the temple's viewing screen showed the inside of a seraphim vessel. Human soldiers in battle armor moved through corridors of living shadow, their weapons blazing with light that seemed to come from stars. Leading them was a woman with sergeant's stripes on her armor, her face calm and determined as she fought creatures that had terrorized entire galaxies. "How are they resisting?" Luminous screamed, his perfect composure finally cracking as he watched his fellow seraphim being cut down by human weapons. "How are they fighting beings of pure psychic energy?" The human sergeant looked up at one of the ship's viewing screens, as if she could see Lumineth himself. When she spoke, her voice was deadly calm and filled with a confidence that came from a lifetime of surviving impossible odds. "Because," she said, her weapon cutting through another shadow creature, "we come from a world that never gave us the luxury of false hope." Around the temple, the seraphim were no longer laughing. For the first time in millions of years, they were beginning to understand what it meant to be afraid. These humans, these primitive Deathworlders, were doing something that no civilization had ever done before. They were winning. The battle was far from over, but already the balance of power was shifting. The seraphim had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated what it meant to come from a world where everything tried to kill you from the moment you were born. They were about to learn why humans called their home planet Earth, but the rest of the galaxy called it a death world. The battle for Veltar was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Space itself seemed to burn as three separate fights raged at the same time, each one more desperate than the last. Inside the great temple, Kethmer watched the screens in amazement as human soldiers moved through seraphim vessels like deadly ghosts. These were not the clumsy primitives that Lumineth had mocked. Every movement was precise, every shot perfectly aimed. The humans fought like they had been born for war, which in a way they had been. Captain Lee Junho led one group of soldiers through a seraphim command ship, his weapon cutting through shadow creatures that had once seemed invincible. Behind him, other humans moved with the same deadly calm, their armor scarred, but their determination unshaken. They did not fight with anger or hatred, but with the cold efficiency of people who had learned to kill or be killed from childhood. "These humans," whispered one of the seraphim in the temple, his voice filled with growing fear. "They do not fear us. They do not fear death. How is this possible?" Lumineth was no longer laughing. His hollow eyes burned with rage as he watched his fellow seraphim being destroyed by creatures he had considered beneath notice. "They are animals," he snarled. "Violent, primitive animals who know nothing but destruction." But even as he spoke, Kethmer could see the truth in the human tactics. They were not fighting with mindless violence. Every move was calculated, every attack designed to cause maximum damage with minimum risk. These were the skills of a people who had learned to survive on a world that tried to kill them every single day. On another screen, Commander Park Min-soo was leading the attack on the Devourer fleet. His ships were tiny compared to the massive bioships, but they moved like angry wasps, darting between the giant creatures and striking at their weak points. The weapons they used were strange and terrible mining lasers that had been modified to fire streams of engineered viruses directly into the creatures' nervous systems. Impossible, breathed another seraphim. Those are industrial tools, not weapons of war. But that was exactly what made them so effective. The humans had taken equipment designed for peaceful purposes and turned it into instruments of destruction. The viruses they fired were not random attacks, but carefully designed programs that turned the Devourer's own biology against them. The massive creatures began to convulse and turn on each other as their hive mind fractured. Meanwhile, the human evacuation fleet was working with incredible speed. Transport ships landed on Veltar's surface, and human soldiers ran through the streets, gathering up Zephyrian civilians and carrying them to safety. The paralysis that had held the Zephyrians for so long was finally broken, and they stumbled toward the rescue ships like people waking from a nightmare. "Admiral," came a voice through the communication system. It was Kim Dayun speaking from one of the evacuation ships. "All Zephyrian civilians are aboard our transports. We're ready." For final phase, Captain Lee Junho stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, looking at the tactical display that showed the full scope of the battle. The Seraphim were falling back, their psychic screams of rage echoing through space like the cries of dying gods. The Devourer fleet was in chaos, their hive minds shattered by the viral attacks. But even as they retreated, both enemy forces were regrouping, and the numbers were still overwhelming. For every human ship, there were 1,000 enemy vessels. For every human soldier, there were 10,000 creatures of shadow and hunger. The humans had won the first round, but they could not win a long war against such odds. Lee Junho closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with the calm expression of a man who had already made his peace with death. "Execute Protocol 7, he said quietly. Across the human fleet, something changed. The soldiers who had been fighting with such determination suddenly stopped their attacks and began to withdraw. The ships that had been pressing their advantage began to pull back. On every vessel, crew members who had served together for years exchanged final salutes. Engineer Oh Seung-min, his hand steady, despite what he was about to do, began to activate a device that had been hidden in the Indomitables. Core, it was called a stellar cascade device, and it was the most terrible weapon the humans had ever created. Pilot Nam Soo-jin, her voice calm and professional, began to calculate the trajectory that would take the entire human fleet on a collision course with Veltara's sun. "This is Captain Lee Junho of the Terran Defense Fleet," the captain's voice came through every speaker in the system. "To the Zephyrian people, this is what Deathworlders do. We survive, and we make sure others can survive too. The human fleet, every ship except the evacuation transports that were already jumping to hyperspace, I'll turn toward the system's star." The Indomitable led the way, followed by dozens of other vessels, each one carrying brave souls who had chosen to die so that others might live. The Seraphim finally understood what was happening. "Stop them," Lumineth screamed. "They're going to destroy the star," but it was too late. The human ships dove into the star like bullets fired from a gun, their holes burning away as they plunged toward the core. The stellar cascade device detonated at the exact moment of maximum penetration, turning the star into a directed supernova that consumed everything in the system. From the safety of hyperspace, the Zephyrian refugees watched their sun die in a blaze of light that could be seen across the galaxy. The false angels who had betrayed them were gone, consumed by the fire they had tried to escape. The cosmic horrors that would have devoured them were destroyed, their screams silenced forever. In the aftermath, only the human evacuation fleet remained, carrying the survivors toward a new home among the stars. High Counselor Threndel, his arms trembling with emotion, approached the human captain who now commanded the rescue fleet. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why sacrifice everything for strangers?" Captain Oh Min-young, a woman with kind eyes and scars that told the story of 100 battles, looked out at the expanding cloud of stellar matter that had once been the Veltar system. "Because that's what you do when you come from a world that never stops trying to kill you," she said simply. "You learn that the only way to survive is to make sure others can survive too. The Zephyrians finally understood. Salvation had come. Not from beings of light who promised easy answers, but from those who had learned to fight in the darkness and chosen to share that strength with others. The angels they had prayed for had never come, but the Deathworlders had, and that made all the difference.